Is Michele Chouinard, and I will moderate today's panel. If just in case you don't know where you are in the Mystery Writers of America NorCal chapters panel, where we are going to talk about romance can be murder. We're going to talk about blending romance and mystery in your books today. And we have a great panel. We have a large panel. So what I'm going to have you do is put your questions, any questions you have in chat. Laurie is going to look through those. For the most part, we're going to try to keep the questions to the end, just because we've got so much cool stuff to say and so many cool people to say it. If there's anything that Laurie feels like is really relevant to what we're discussing right at the moment, she's going to break in. So don't hold back the questions. If you have them, throw them in there, and she will take a look at that. At the end of today's meeting, we are going to be giving away a copy of How to Write a Mystery. This is an MWA, excuse me, Mr. Writers, thank you. Laurie King is holding it up. Mystery Writers of America handbook, written by many, many amazing and edited by amazing writers that have so much experience in this. And there's so many gems in there, including a few tidbits about incorporating romance and sex into your mysteries. So we're going to give away a copy of that at the end. But if you're not the lucky person who wins it, I would definitely encourage you to take a look at it, because I love it. I look at it all the time. All right, so
sorry, Michele, are we
yes.
just we're going to draw the name of somebody who did a comment on it?
I think Laurie can tell me for sure, but I think we're just going to draw from the participants at the end.
Okay.
Laurie?
I'm keeping track of who is here. I'm going to randomly number generate. I'm going to limit it to only the people who are in attendance, and then I will pick the number by the registration number. So I'm going to keep it in order of how people registered, randomly generate that number, and just select from that line.
And they do have to be present at the end to win, correct?
I think that would be better, so we can get them to come on to camera and tell us all how happy they are.
And I see that Dana has asked, will there be a replay? There will be a replay of this. It will be available for Mystery Writers of America NorCal attendees. It will be available for also the Bay Area romance writer attendees. So those groups have it. And if you are not a member, how come you're not a member? Think about being a member. We got all kinds of great stuff like these panels. So I'm just saying, check it out. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shift into introducing all of our panels. There is so much more to say about these people than I can say in this quick introduction. So Laurie is going to, a couple of times throughout the presentation, put up all of the links, the social media links, well, the website links, mainly, easy for me to say, up in the chat. So if there's anybody in particular that you want to check out and get more information about, you're going to be able to do that. So without any further ado, I'm going to go in alphabetical order here. We're going to start with Beth Barany. She is an award-winning author who loves creating magical tales of romance, mystery, and adventure that empower women and girls to be heroes in their own lives. I love that. Her book, Into the Black, a sci-fi mystery, is a J.D. McAllister mystery, and it blends mystery, romance, and sci-fi, and it is available now. Linda S. Gunther is the author of 6 published romantic suspense novels, as well as several children's books and short pieces. And her most recent romantic suspense novel is Death is a Great Disguiser. I love that. Love that title. That is awesome. Laurie R. King is a multiple award-winning, I didn't even try to list them all, New York Times bestseller of 30 novels and other works, including the Mary Russell Sherlock Holmes novels and the new Raquel Lang, am I saying that right? The new Raquel Lang Cold Case series. She's a Baker Street irregular and an MWA Grandmaster, and her newest book, Back to the Garden, is set in San Francisco and features a cold case, an historical commune, and a serial killer. And I have started reading it. It's really good. Check it out. Margaret Lucke, is it Lucky, right? Margaret Lucky. Writes tales of love, ghosts, and murder, sometimes all 3 in one book. Her most recent novels are House of Desire, the second book in the Claire Scanlon Haunted House series, and Snow Angel, featuring San Francisco artist and detective Jess Randolph in Search for a Missing Child. Also a very good book, by the way. I'm sure all of these are good. Some of them I have managed to finish before this presentation. T.E. MacArthur is, in addition to being an accidental sports reporter, which is my favorite fun fact about her, writes in steampunk, noir punk mystery, and paranormal mystery genres. Her newest novel, The Skin Thief, involves a pair of ex-lovers investigating strange happenings set in the Four Corner region of Colorado, not far from where she grew up. Tammy Qualls writes mysteries and romances that incorporate queer themes. Her agent is currently shopping her first novel, which is a historical mystery set in 1920s Long Beach. And she's currently working on a historical romantic suspense novel, which is also set in 1920s Southern California. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Eileen Rendahl, who is a national best-selling award-winning author and ghostwriter of mystery, thriller, urban fantasy, science fiction, and romance. She's also written under the names Christy Abbott, Lillian Bell, and Eileen Carr. And if you find that confusing, you can just imagine what it's like being inside her head. Her two romantic suspense books, written as Eileen Carr, are Hold Back the Dark and Vanished in the Night. All right, so that is all of our awesome panel. And I'm going to, for full disclosure here, I'm going to say that the reason that I wanted to do this panel is because while I have some romance in my books, I have a project that I'm working on that really sort of ramps up the amount of romance I'm having to put in. And I'm realizing just exactly how horrible I am at it. So I wanted an opportunity to hear from some people that are really good at it and get some tips. So I'm going to be asking some questions from pretty much a novice, ignorant sort of perspective on this. So please forgive me if I get things wrong or if I ask stupid questions. But the first thing that I wanted to do is just find out what the definition of romantic suspense even is. And I got sort of two different answers to that in my research. So I'm going to use those as kind of a jumping off point here. One was that romantic suspense is a romance where some sort of mystery or thriller element is propelling the action. And then the other answer I got was that romantic suspense is a book where both romance and mystery play equal roles. So right off the bat, we have two very different definitions of what that is. And I thought that that would be a great way to start asking about how mystery and romance, these are two genres that have really established, fairly rigid in some cases, genre expectations, things that your readers are going to want to be there. And if they're not there, they're going to be annoyed with you, right? So how do we navigate when we're blending these? How do we navigate that, especially with respect to all of the different subgenres that we have of both mystery and romance? And I'm going to kick that off by starting with Laurie King, because she's right below me on my screen.
I'm catty-corner from you on my screen, so hi. Yeah, I'm tempted to say you just submit the book to both a romantic suspense editor and a suspense romantic editor and see who sells it. That's what it is, right? So, that's my temptation. But yeah, I mean, I think that it sort of depends on what you as a writer envision the book as to begin with. And as you're doing your editorial process, one of the things that in doing a second draft is you're looking at the subgenre, whether it's mysteries or romance, and you're trying to make it more firmly, settle it more firmly into that subgenre. So that if I'm writing, if I'm writing a cozy in the mystery world, and I find that the timing is such and the suspense is ramped up to a degree that it really isn't cozy anymore, I need to think of that in my rewrite and shift the whole thing so that it matches it from beginning to end. And I think that when you're talking about subgenres within a world of mysteries or romance, or whether you're talking about which world it belongs in, the same applies.
I think that's a really great point, and one I hadn't thought of, which is sort of going back after the fact and fitting that into a framework. I saw Beth nodding a lot during this, so I'm going to throw it over to you.
Sure. Well, I really agree with Laurie. Your first draft might be messy. It might be unclear how much of which you want to focus on, even as the author, you might not know. And it's in the revision process that I decide, in that first book, Into the Black, I had to really settle it deeply in being a police procedural with a whole science fiction world with some romance threaded through that supported the investigative process, that helped and, well, of course, first hindered and then, at some point helps. And I had to do it in a way that I made the decision to please romance readers and not care so much about science fiction readers. And notice also that the straight mystery readers might not come over because they're not as adventurous as romance readers. So I had to also determine who is the readership. And it wasn't going to be the hardcore sci-fi, and it wasn't going to be the hardcore straight mystery readers who just want either historical or contemporary. I was doing something adventurous and new. So that all came into consideration in the editing process and helped me get the mixture right, so to speak. 2 parts this, 1 part that, and hit that tone. And then also I realized now in hindsight, I have a strong, maybe like drama thread, because I'm really dealing with a young woman's change slowly over the first 4 books, but change about her own internal landscape. So I didn't even realize I was throwing in sort of that whole self-discovery element, but I guess I couldn't not. That also is so important. So, but all these considerations take place slowly over the revision process with lots of feedback from critique partners and beta readers in the process.
So that's interesting to me. I've seen so we've talked about having editors, like 2 different kinds of editors, and now some really good critique partners. So I'm going to come back and touch in on that because I find that really interesting. But I see Linda is nodding most enthusiastically at this point, so I'm going to throw it over to her.
Oh, well, this is such an exciting topic. And what I did was, when I was thinking about some questions, especially this one, I went back and looked at my 6 romantic suspense novels and thought, well, what the heck did I do? Because it's not top of mind. So what I realized, because I really went through all 6 of them and looked at it, is that pretty much I can say that in the beginning of the novel, I really start with a conflict. Something happens, something that hopefully will grab the reader on the suspense, usually on the suspense side. And then I quickly introduce the potential romance, or, 2 people in conflict that end up being romantic, or past lover comes back to past lover and they reunite, but in a tough situation. And then I looked at further and I thought, okay, I hit on early on both. And then I dive deep into the suspense. And while I'm diving deep into the suspense, I add in all the complexities of the romantic or potential romantic relationship. So they're both, and you guys all do this, and probably a lot of the people listening. So they're both transitioning over time and developing. And if I put a scene into the book, or a chapter, if you will, I make sure, because I need to do this in the edit process and with critique partners, I really make sure that whatever scene I'm putting in there, whether it's romance or edgy suspense, that it's moving my story forward. It's not just there for fun. And I think, the other thing I do is I add twists and turns so that there's some twist and turn and surprise for the reader. It's not all just moving everything forward. And the last thing, it's like a funny thing, but I think, Michelle, you mentioned it, and other people, I always have a pet in my books. I always have like a dog, or I have a female veterinarian that has all kinds of pets that are coming into her office, So I just realized that. I didn't even think of it until I saw the black cat move across the screen.
I don't know if this is happening with the audience, but I know like 1,000 questions are popping up into my mind. So one of the first things that came up into my mind when you were talking about that is how I wonder if there are different types of suspense and suspense situations that are going to match on with different romance. I'm going to use the word trope.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
like you mentioned, it sounded from what you were saying,
Yeah.
you didn't say this phrase, but like that you were
Yeah.
talking about possibly like enemies to lovers kind of things, which is what I'm sort of
Right.
doing in mine. And it made me instantly think of Thena, because you mentioned the past lovers, and in Skin Thieves, she's got these past lovers that come and work together. So I'm wondering, there must be certain sorts of situations that lend themselves, in the mystery tropes that lend themselves and pair up more naturally with romance tropes. And on that thought, I'm gonna go to Thena, and then I'm gonna get to Margaret, because I noticed that Margaret is not a nodder, and if I use my nodding criteria, she will never get to speak. So let's go to Thena first, and then we'll go to Margaret.
Well, I was thinking along the same lines, was that it really does have to match. It just can't be, oh, well, your romance author needs to hit this beat and that beat and this beat with, and you read these books and you listen to these lectures on people who tell you that you have to hit beat A, B, and C in order to satisfy this audience. Well, Margaret will agree with me, because we had been chatting last weekend at a meeting, and we both write paranormal blah blah blah, and for me it's a paranormal romantic thriller. So we have to handle all of these different elements and mix them in a way that is not old or stale. And so going back, tropes can be a wonderful thing, and they're fine and dandy to get you started, but sometimes we have to bust through. And when you're dealing with that many things, sometimes they call you to approach something differently. I think that the more frightening, the more violent, perhaps, the situation is, the less it's going to be a happy-go-lucky little romance. So, that's kind of extreme, but, you could kind of see how one portion of your genre demands a different kind of response from the other. Cozies, they have the murder, they have the violence, but it's off screen. So there's room in a cozy, in my opinion, for there to be the happier, the more, if you will, realistic kind of romance.
Exactly.
And there is one other thing that I think I want to throw in, and maybe it will come up later, but we also kind of have to be sure that when we're talking romantic versus romance, those are two different things. I had to wrestle with whether I was going to have romantic even in the description of my book, because I don't hit the romance genre beats. I don't touch them. There's no sex. Sorry, kids, no sex this time. Lots of ooh, ah, boy, he has a nice figure, but nothing like what you would want if you were looking for a romance book. But there are romantic elements, and to ignore that there are romantic elements would be to miss reaching out to an audience that enjoys that. So it is a paranormal romantic thriller. And I think Margaret does the same thing. So if you don't mind, I'm kind of setting up for Margaret to be the next
Please
one.
Okay. Yes, indeed. I'm going to have to practice my nodding. Yeah, I'm with Thena on this. To my mind, the definition of romantic suspense has to do with balance. A romantic suspense is actually a subgenre of the romance genre. I mean, that's where you see it placed rather than being placed under mystery and suspense. When people characterize genres, now we could get into a whole discussion of, what's the point of characterizing genres, because, it's a marketing construct. It can be limiting to your imagination when you're just writing, as opposed to a suspense that has a strong romance subplot. The goals of those two different things, the romance and the suspense or the mystery, are different. A goal and a part of the definition of a romance novel is the HEA, or the happy ever after ending, or occasionally the HFN, the happy for now ending. Whereas the goal of a suspense novel or a mystery is to achieve in the end some sort of order and justice, to restore that in the world of these characters, which isn't always a happy thing. I mean, that doesn't mean everybody's going to live happily ever after.
Or even live.
Or even live, exactly. So it's the balance. And romantic suspense, as I understand it, is when those two elements are equal. That, as one definition I read put it, it says, the stakes are high in both the romance and the suspense fronts. When I was invited on my House of series, the Haunted House series got started at a dinner I had with an author friend and an editor. My author friend was having dinner with an editor of hers who happened to be in town, and they invited me to come along, and we started batting around ideas. And this editor had a paranormal romance line. And I said, okay, that's fine. I'll play with that. The problem is I don't know how to write a book that doesn't have a dead body in it. So mine became, I mean, what's the point of the story otherwise? So mine became a paranormal romantic suspense. And it was a challenge for me to make that romance, one, believable. I hope I did. And to give it that emphasis, that kind of balanced emphasis in that story. But one of the things that I think is an advantage of this is that I've read and I've seen it attributed to various people, but the point that the purpose of fiction is to give your readers a powerful emotional experience. And one of the things that I like about blending romance versus, or not versus, but romance with the thriller aspect, is it gives you a wider range of emotional possibilities to play with. And so the reader gets a wider range of emotions to experience. And I think that can contribute to a richer read for the reader, and more fun for the writer too.
On that note, I'm gonna chime in something here I am expert on, because some of you may know that in my old day job, I'm a developmental psychologist. So I know a little bit about psychology. It's interesting. There's a study where if you slip people caffeine and they don't know it, and you put them in a room together, and you put them in a room with an attractive person, they'll feel agitated from the caffeine and they'll assume they're attracted to this other person. Actually, it doesn't even have to be another attractive person. So what you said, Peggy, was making me think, I wonder if it's the case with a reader where if you get that adrenaline flowing with the thriller aspect, that invests them more in that romance even. So I'm thinking what an interesting side effect of this genre, of this romantic suspense, or this blending of these two, to be able to tap into those two sorts of emotional responses that you're talking about and sort of double up your emotional impact there. I think that's really cool.
Good insight.
I'm gonna throw it to Eileen, because she shouldn't be last every time, and then Tammy, will go to you. Go ahead, Eileen.
Well, I was thinking what Margaret was talking about with balance, and the way I've approached romantic suspense. We talk about, like, at the end of a mystery, you want that balance of justice happening. But what I really like in a romantic suspense is when the two main characters balance each other somehow, that they each have a different set of skills or a different temperaments that somehow come together that make them able to solve that mystery together. And then it gets all twined up, and then you can't really pull it apart. And that's when I feel like I've done a good job.
That's a really great point that actually I don't think I've included anywhere in my potential questions, is the idea of how having this romance in there can impact that characterization and the different wounds that you're balancing in these characters, and how you can bring that back to enrich your mystery. So as I turn it over to Tammy, I'm going to leave that hovering there if people want to talk more about that. You don't have to, Tammy. Have at it.
No, I love it. And I apologize. My internet keeps glitching, of course, today of all days. But yeah, no, to kind of build on that too, like I think another thing to think about when you're writing, and like Laurie said, maybe you're not sure if it's a romantic suspense or a suspenseful romantic book, but to think about like how are those characters interacting? And oh, I just lost it. My mind just went blank. But to think about like your end goal, like if you're really into a really deep mystery that has lots of plot points and it's very technical and there's puzzles to be solved, you might not have time to fully develop like a romance side of things. So sometimes, since you're probably going to have a limited number of oh no, did I glitch out?
That's okay. Just keep talking.
Okay,
We'll tell you if we can't hear you. Uh-oh, we can't hear you. All right.
Here.
Oh, no. Okay. So I will, as soon as you come back, I will, there you go. Go ahead. You're back.
Sorry.
That's okay.
But just I don't know when I glitched out, sorry, but just to consider before you start getting into it, are you going to have so much mystery and so many puzzles that you need solving? Are you really going to have time to develop that romance? Because it's kind of hard to do a really complex mystery and do that, really develop the romance elements of that at the same time. So that's just something to consider as you start writing your book.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, that if you do have this really complex mystery, you know, you're probably going to be better off going a sort of a police procedural or an amateur sleuth route rather than cozy. And if you've got, you know, this kidnapping and a ticking bomb, and you're probably going to be better going a more of a thriller route and definitely not a cozy route. And I would imagine that if, like, I don't, again, I'm kind of just talking aloud here, but I guess you're always talking aloud, aren't you? I'm thinking aloud. I would imagine that there are some romance tropes, like if you've got a friends to enemy, that might work better in a cozy where you have a chance to, I guess, explore that, or a high octane sort of setting of, you know, you've got these two people that have to solve this problem and they hate each other, but they better figure some stuff out really fast. So I definitely would like, I think we've got a lot of stuff between the issues of characterization and how that plays in, and also the questions that came up regarding using different editors and using different kinds of beta readers. I think I'm going to go another round on this before we switch to a different to a different question. So I'm going to sort of shake up the order a little bit again, and I'm going to start with Peggy this time. Yeah, you weren't expecting that, were you?
No, I wasn't. We're talking about editors.
Well, any of those kinds of issues that you have something more that you want to say about, because so much has been said since we started.
Well, I think it does come back to what kind of balance that you want to have. And, you know, when you're dealing with the tropes, and I tend not to think about tropes when I'm writing, you know, it's, I think they're in some ways a bigger thing in romance than they are in mystery, although mystery certainly has them. But, you know, where it becomes how you work the romance in, you know, like the friends to enemies, or the enemy, well, sometimes it is friends to enemies, the enemies to friends trope in romance, where they start out hating each other and end up falling in love. You know, and you can certainly do that as they're working together to try to solve a mystery. They're thrown into this situation where they have to deal with it. But I think it depends on the integration you do between the two. You know, if you have a romance, you can have a romance subplot in a mystery or any kind of book that is sort of separate from the actual investigation part. You know, this is happening, you know, it's part of your character's day job, but the romance is happening in the evenings, or, you know, they may bounce ideas off each other, but they're not both actively involved in that same situation, in the investigative situation in the same kind of way. So that's part of, to me, the differentiation. And I think they're both valid approaches, you know, to have a kind of a separate subplot that you know, your detective character goes to the romance partner or the desired romance partner, hoped for romance partner, you know, for advice and support, or maybe that person's doing something that gets in the way of their ability to do the investigation. But they are separate threads. They're not woven together into a single braid in quite the same way.
Got it. And by the way, I should say, if I call on you and you're not ready, tell me to pass or come back to you, and because I'm sort of trying to balance it. So let's go to Tammy while she's here and say, is there anything else that you wanted to add to those points? Or I noticed that we're getting a fair amount of questions about subgenres and linking that up. So if you want to speak to that too, please do. And I think we lost her again. So I'm gonna give it back to Eileen.
And I'm trying to remember what I'm supposed to be answering.
Sorry. And any other comments that you have about this, particularly about subgenres? And if you want to pass, I'll send it over to Linda.
No, so it does get complicated. So I had one series where it was, I mean, I just wrote the book I felt like writing. And my agent sent it out, and we had interest from this editor who said, love it, but it's not really an urban fantasy. It's not really a paranormal romance. And I need it to be one thing or the other. And it was really hard to figure out how to balance all those elements, because it wasn't just the romance and the mystery. Then you also had the paranormal elements that you had to be developing at the same time. So Margaret was talking about a braid. It very much felt like a braid. But it wasn't, I ended up pushing it more to the romance side, which was fine, except it always felt a little not organic to the series to me. It's like I wanted the romantic tension. I wanted that, the banter, the back and forth, you know, like the fun part of dating, you know? I wanted that in there. But if it was, my editor was very specific. It's like, I need at least 3 sex scenes. And I'm like, do I have to? It didn't feel organic to me. And I ended up doing it, and it ended up being fine, but it was hard.
Yeah, let me, I know Linda had something she wanted to say, and then I'm going to kind of shift topics a little bit on that note. So Linda, what was it you want to?
Okay, well, you know, as I was listening, you know, I'm thinking, and it always bothers me, but, you know, we have this genre called romantic suspense, and it starts with the word romantic. And it's almost like, you know, a lot of us flip it, and it's suspense romantic, suspenseful romance versus romantic suspense. And I think that it really just depends on where your head goes when you're writing a story. The other thing that I realize about genre, and you know, again, you know, I may not be right, but I think that besides romance and suspense, if I really look at how I write, I also include other things like tensions in family. And my feeling is, if you don't, I mean, at least as a writer, I feel like if I don't include what's really happening personally with the main characters in terms of how they're relating with their family and the tensions and the childhood that they had, then I'm missing this whole picture. So for me, I really like to include more than the 2 aspects.
The other
Let's
thing,
face it, most of our wounds come from family, don't
well,
they, right?
Michelle, sounds like you're an expert. I'm a master's in psych, so I think that way
So
too.
you get it.
And the other thing is, I'm really bad at this. Like, the reason sometimes I get frustrated with romance, just thinking write a romance, and a lot of talks I've been to, and they say, you got to wrap it up so they're both together and happy,
Happily ever
maybe
after.
temporarily or maybe long term. But I just can't do it. I have to just go with where my heart takes me. And it may be at the end that they split.
And I think this is actually a good point to transition, because my without spoiling anything, my first book, The Dancing Girls, I ended it in a way that subverted some genre expectations, and boy did I get a whole, there's a lot of people that have plenty to say about that. But I don't necessarily feel badly about it, because either way it created an emotional response, like Peggy was saying, and I think that that's an important thing. But this brings me to sort of the next potential point that I wanted to talk about, which is the biggest pitfalls of blending these two kinds of genres. And so, speaking to any of the people like me that are newbies here, what are some of the pitfalls that you've had to take into account, and how have you managed to navigate that? And I'm going to go ahead and start with Tammy, because she seems pretty steady right now.
Of all the days, right? I think one of the pitfalls is pacing. You're pacing your suspense plot out, you have your mystery, and then you're laying that romance on top of it. And you don't want to go too crazy with the romance in the beginning, because then it's hard to keep it up. So you have to kind of build that. So I think, don't throw a sex scene in the opening scene of the book unless that's what you're doing. And you can keep up that intensity. Things like that. I think pacing is really a hard pitfall.
That's a good one. I'm gonna turn it over to Laurie, and then I'll follow that up with Thina, just to give everybody a little warning there. Laurie King.
Pacing?
Yeah, or whatever your biggest pitfalls are that you've had to deal with, and the advice that you would give those of us learning about this.
Why don't we talk about sex?
Next, I promise, right after this.
Okay. Yeah, I think that knowing the industry, I mean, if you're trying to make a living out of this job, knowing the industry and knowing why things are the way they are. I mean, on the one hand, it's stupid to have to worry about whether the book is more romance or more suspense, because it's the book. The book is the book. But if you're interested in making a career out of this thing, you need to understand how publishing houses work, or how self-publishing works. And if you choose not to follow what is generally accepted as the balance between romance and suspense, for example, or why you do things one way for a thriller and one way for a classic detective whodunit, if you choose not to do those, fine. But it's something that you need to know as an active choice, rather than just do it because you didn't know what the difference was. So
that's a really great piece of advice for, I think, all areas of writing. So, all right, Thina, and then we'll talk to Beth.
I would say I have a lot of problem with the idea of writing to market. And then, if we're talking about the market of the romantic, because first off, the market will change by the time you hear about it. And I think that unless it's your true voice, your true story that is in agreement with the market, you're always going to force it, and your reader is always going to pick up on it. Even if you're brilliant about it, your reader will always pick up on it. I think the greatest pitfall is not being honest with your story, but that also has the other side of the coin. And that is, every time we write a book and offer page 1 to a reader, we've made a promise. And so we have to be careful about the promise that we make to our readers. The promise, if you promise that you're going to give them, say in your back blurb, which I finally learned recently, by the way, if nobody knew this, here's your lesson. Your back of your cover blurb is not a plot summary. It is a statement to sell your book. So you don't have to tell anybody really what's going on, just sell your book. But you're making a promise, and that promise has to be kept by the end of the book. And if you're going to make a promise that you're going to give them suspense, a thrill, paranormal with some romance in it, don't overpromise it. Let them know from page 1 that they're going to get a certain kind of story, and then write it honestly. And I think readers are fine with that. I don't know if agents and publishers are, but agents and publishers have to put it somewhere in the bookstores. They have to be able to, we all have to pick our Amazon top keywords and our where do they put it in the Library of Congress. We all have to do that.
Right.
That's for business.
But business aside, I think that that's a really good pitfall, again, sort of across all genres, really, is that to make sure that the promises that you're making, once you finish your book, go back and read those first chapters and make sure that you have fulfilled all of those promises that you're making. Okay, so let's talk with Beth about her pitfalls of blending the genres, and then we'll go to Margaret.
Yeah, I love this topic. And I love what you're saying, Tammy, because trying to follow the market is very, very hard. It's constantly shifting. Who knows what's going to happen? And I set out when I started my sci-fi mystery series to do this thing that I didn't see in the marketplace. And so part of my own pitfall / challenge / goody, like it's all in one, which is trying to do something new, trying to do something that I'd seen hints of, like mostly on television, but not in books. And kind of pulling together some of my favorite things: adventure, mystery, some sexy, more like the tension. I play a lot with the tension between the romantic partners. And also I'm writing a series. So I'm playing with, well, what happens in book 2 and then book 3? And now I'm writing book 5. What happens there? So my biggest challenge and prize is really following this unknown. I'm constantly asking, do I have the mix of genres right? And of course, that's the wrong question to ask when you're writing a first draft. So I just have to sort of follow my nose and go off in these interesting tangents while I'm writing this first draft. And it is exciting for those of us here. We're all doing this interesting cross-genre blend. And I saw in the comments, readers love that. Readers love something. They want like familiar, but something new. And so if we've never seen, we've seen it, space pirates, we've seen that kind of thing, but have we really seen space pirates meets investigation meets world saving action? I don't know. I'm playing around with some of my themes, but
Amish vampires in space. That's a thing that exists. And it's actually quite well, it does well. So there you go.
Right.
I think one of the things that I'm taking away from all of this, one of my big takeaways is going to be that in that first draft, maybe don't worry about most of this stuff. Do what you need to do. And then when you're going back and revising, take a look at, here's the mystery genre that I want to be in. Here is the romance trope that I really want to make sure that I'm hitting. Am I balancing that correctly? I see some wincing when I use the word trope. I apologize. I know that can have some bad there's some bad juju around that. I just mean the expectations in the romance. Am I hitting those things right? How do I need to adjust my balance? So that's one of the big takeaways I think I'm going to come from this, is that, this sort of the advice I've heard before, which is like your first draft is for you, your second draft is for your reader, right? So I'm writing that one down for sure. And as I throw it over to Margaret.
Okay, well, the challenges are many. Keeping up the tension is one, keeping the balance between the two or the many elements, because even though we have romance and we have suspense, there's often many other things going on in our books as well. And every now and then they threaten to take over in ways you don't expect. One of the things that I have learned in writing is that the book you think you're setting out to write is very rarely the book you end up with when you finish that first draft. They take up, they take on a life of their own, and the characters have their own ideas about where things are going to go and the decisions that they are going to have you make about it one of the challenges for me was that when I finished the first book in my Haunted House series, House of Whispers, I had achieved the HEA for my characters. And, where was I going to take it for there in book 2? And frankly, in book 2, it didn't, pursuing that same romance. I mean, it was resolved. That wasn't going to cut the bill. I gave the romance in this case in book 2. In fact, there's about 3 of them that develop over the course of the books, one of which does not lead to an HEA, although a couple of them do, that involved other major characters. And I often have in my books what I think of as the secondary protagonist, a character who's in that book and is a very strong secondary character that is often at the heart of the mystery, from the sense of this is the person at the center of that mystery, suspense, thriller situation. This is the one that person is happening to, as opposed to my sleuth who comes in and tries to help out and fix things and make them right. So, that was a challenge for me, was with a series, how do you keep it going? I know that there are people who do. In fact, I recently read an article by Deborah Crombie, who I don't know that hers are romantic suspense. In fact, I would say they're not, but they do have this ongoing relationship between her 2 main characters that started out as a work relationship and over the course of the books developed into a romantic relationship, and then eventually into a marriage, and then a marriage with family and kids. And they've had to deal with all of these issues over the course of the series.
I see that Laurie S has popped in, so I'm assuming that there's something that she wants to say, but I do want to follow that up because I know we've had a reader question about how to keep stuff alive over the series. So Laurie, go ahead.
Yep, I just wanted to bring to the front a few of the comments and questions that you guys are getting.
Yes, please.
So the comments are great. If you're talking, Saren says, if you're talking about romance, you got to love tropes. You got to learn to do it. Know the rules so you can break them. Laura King actually popped into the chat and responded to that. That's going to be part of a good reading part for anyone who wins our drawing today. That's chapter 1. And as a reader, Robin said that readers are going to like multiple genres. So that's okay. You guys hit on that. There are questions about how steamy does it get? Michelle, I know you have a steamy question.
That's next. We're going to dive into that. That's going to be our last question.
Okay, and keeping it alive and over series, and what's the difference, that spread of when does it get really steamy, and how to keep it romantic. So I just also want to tell you before I go away again, not to worry so much about the time, because we don't have to keep it to an hour. It's just us. We're all friends here. And much like sex and romance, if you're having a good time, it should just pretty much go on as long as you want it to. So that's all I have to say.
I know the time is flying. I feel like everybody's really only had a chance to talk like twice, and we're already coming up on past 45 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apologize to Eileen, because she was who I was going to go to next. And what I'm going to say is feel free to take double your time, but I want to introduce this last topic, which is the question of sex and how it intersects with our genres. And I got a lot of private comments from the panelists on this, so I know that this is a controversial topic. So some people are like sex. Some people are like, it's not important. We're talking about romance. Romance is what is important. Sex is secondary. So the fact that I got this variety of personal responses from people on the panel makes me think that we've got this huge continuum of writers. We've got this huge continuum of readers. So I am just going to jump in there and turn it over to Eileen to talk about what are your thoughts on these questions of sex and romance and how it all works out together.
So I have feelings about this. So for me, romance is what's happening in our hearts and our heads. Sex is happening in some other body parts. But like the whole balance thing that we were talking about earlier, they're connected. So I've read a couple romances where it's all like, ooh, he's got a cute butt, let's go to bed, and it's all mechanics. And I've read some other ones where it's all in your head, and I don't find either of those satisfying. I want the whole thing. It's not enough for him to have a cute butt. He's also got to like be kind or be smart or capable or something and vice versa. I need both of those things. In terms of steam level, that's just personal taste. How much of it do you want to have on the page? How much don't you want to have on the page? I am personally kind of like to wink and shut the door, but I'm not against, some of the mechanics being there.
I'm gonna give it to Linda here in a second. I want to say that Laurie R. King sent me a couple of good quotes from the How to Write a Murder. One of them I loved was that the best sex scenes are about bad sex, not good sex. And that's I think that's Katrina McPherson, right, that said that. And I find that really intriguing and interesting. And especially because as a reader, I love to read sex scenes. As a writer, I hate them. They terrify me. So I'm always looking for a way to do a decent job. And now I'm thinking maybe write some real good bad sex would be the way to do that. But let me turn it over to Linda.
Okay, well, before I talk about sex, I just want to make one comment on the last topic, and that is one of my main pitfalls, and not me so much anymore, but that I've seen, is that because we're dealing with two different genres and we're blending them, or maybe three different genres, and we're blending them, we can include too many characters. And including too many characters can confuse the reader. And that's what I find in my critique group that I've been in for like 6 or 7 years now, is when we critique, we really pinpoint that. And it's so helpful when you have people that are not key characters, but for some reason we have to give their name and some background, and we don't. It could be the guy who's behind the counter. Anyway, forget that. What about sex? Okay, I have to say, I never predict when I write a story. I've been writing a lot of short stories. I've gotten like 45 of them published in the last 12 to 18 months, which is weird. I never wrote short stories. But here's what I learned about the spiciness. It really depends on where my characters take me. And also in a scene that has sex, it could be romantic. We all know this, but it could just be lust and sex. And it may not be with the two main characters. And, it really, for me, it just depends on where the story takes me.
Or it could be some really hot sex with a person that the person doesn't end up with. So
Exactly.
I noticed 2 sets of strong reactions to what you were saying. Beth's were the strongest, and then actually Peggy was nodding. So we're going to go first with Beth and then to Peggy.
I can't even remember what I'm nodding to, but I find it, yes, that's right. It's where the characters want to go. So I was a little nervous that I had some kind of steamy moments in the first sci-fi mystery, and it changed in the other books, and I was kind of worried about that. Well, because the relationship changed, and I just really had to honor that and really pinpoint, well, what's really going on in the relationship and how is it impacting the mystery, and really honor that and not worry so much, because I'm not writing romance. I am writing sci-fi mystery with romantic elements. So I want it to be different. I don't want it to feel repetitive. I want it to keep the reader a little bit on their toes. Ooh, what's going to happen between the two love interests? And that's how I handle it. And there's a reason why I didn't stick with romance. Like I'm an adventurer of the heart and of the mind, and so my books are gonna feel that adventurousness. I saw there was a question in the chat around critique partners, and can I speak to that?
Sure, go ahead. And then we'll go to Margaret, and then we'll go to Laurie King.
And like what the previous speaker was saying, critique partners also keep me on the straight and narrow. They'll help me see whether or not my characters are feeling true to themselves, because it's hard. I lose track of that. And also sometimes I don't agree with them. And it's a trio. So one person will say, oh, I love this. And the other person will say, I hate that. And then it's all back to me. I have to decide. So having experienced critique partners who can give you their feedback without telling you what to do is, I think, so key. And just real quick, in terms of finding critique partners, I mean, this community and the intersecting writing communities, it's great to just speak up about what you want and what you're looking for and the kind of end goal. It's great if you are with people who have a similar end goal, like if everyone wants to be publishing, that's great. Or if everyone is on the first drafting stage and they're all just there to support each other. So as with everything, it's important to know what you want as a writer and what kind of people you want to be around, and to really set some ground rules for the group to work
And
well.
yeah, I would definitely encourage people at the end, once we're done the official program, if you're looking for a critique group, if you want more information about that, throw it in the chat and we will return to that. But I'm going to turn it over to Margaret to hear her thoughts about sex and romance.
Sex and romance. When I started writing the first book in this series, House of Whispers, I wasn't necessarily expecting to put any sex in it. I knew it had to be romance because that's what, the publisher's line was all about, romance. But as Linda said, it's depends a lot on the characters, and the characters let me know that, no, this is relationship's going to take that next step. So I went with it, and it was, I didn't have any real confidence in my ability to write a sex scene that would be convincing, but I played with it. Well, one of the little exercises I gave myself during NaNoWriMo, I actually wasn't expecting to do it, but I did NaNoWriMo one year, and one of my characters started off on this, and I got almost 50,000 pages of this very hot romance thing.
Words, I hope, not pages.
Words. I mean, not pages, words. You're right. Each one felt like hard won, like a whole page, but 50,000 words. And most of it did not end up in the book. But it was a freeing kind of thing, because when you're just pouring words on the page that fast, you don't really have time to think about the individual words. So it was what felt organic but it depends a little on what you're writing, what kind of book you're writing. And again, we've talked about not wanting to be trapped too much by genre and subgenre expectations. But, in romance, there's the whole ranking of, is it sweet? Is it spicy? Is it, sexy? Is it this and that? And I don't know all of the, I can't give you the specifics of all the levels. Someone else might be able to.
Tammy actually has some great graphics. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but Tammy has some great graphics. Tammy, if you want to throw them in the chat, feel free. Sorry, back to Peggy.
Okay, that's fine. I'd love them. But there's also, it depends on what you're writing. In cozies, there's a lot of publishers who do not want any sex in that book, not even the chaste goodnight kiss or the holding hands. I have a friend who's a cozy writer, and she's always having to write around this. At midnight, she invited him in to come in through the front door. End of scene. At the breakfast table the next morning, she poured him a cup of coffee, and you kind of know that he spent the night, and you kind of know that they spent the night having a good time, but it is never referred to. So
you see the boots under the bed.
I'm not even sure the boots under the bed would have passed muster with this particular publisher, but so you have to know, what the expectations are for that particular genre or subgenre. And that can be a tricky thing too. Thinking about, okay, this is the kind of book that I'm trying to write. And I agree with everybody else that you're not really trying to write a kind of book. You're trying to tell a good story in the beginning. But what are the reader expectations going to be for how this book is going to be marketed? Because you do, as you learned, Michele, if you don't follow the reader expectations to a certain degree, readers notice, and sometimes they object.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is a good counterpoint to what we were saying before about you shouldn't write to a genre. You should be writing the story that you want to write. But you do then, I think, when it comes to that revision, have to be honest with yourself about, if I'm going to try to sell this as a cozy, the sex has to go, and I have to be willing to kill that particular darling. So unfortunately, we do, if we want to, I mean, self-publishing gives you a little bit of freedom, but the reason that publishers enforce those expectations, right, is because the readers have those expectations. So we do have to have a little bit of dose of reality at some point in that process with respect to, are there hard and fast lines that I need to be aware of and to respect? And with that, I'm going to shut up and give it to Laurie King, who knows way more about this than I do.
Do I know more about sex than you do, Michelle?
Well, you know more about writing sex than I do. I can promise you that.
No, I mean, it's one of those areas that is really tough to do effectively because it's so powerful. I mean, it's like an act of violence in the middle of a book that if it doesn't balance absolutely right with everything around it, it just sticks out in the reader's mind and is difficult to incorporate into the story. I think that I believe that there's a bad sex award for writing. That is a really effective example of why you should never write sex, because
an award I can win. Yay!
On the page, these look, I mean, you can imagine that to the writer, they look quite fine. And then when they go cold in print, you think, oh no, honey, really not. I generally take the approach that less is more when it comes to sex, which drives a lot of my readers nuts. Because they're left with, every other book has one of these steamy scenes where the protagonist's husband is brushing her hair. The problem is that the books, these are the Murray Russell Sherlock Holmes books. I mean, they're written as if they were memoirs by a woman in her 70s or 80s. And she wouldn't write about that. So you got to kind of slip these little things in every so often so that we know what she's talking about, but she's not writing it. I think the only time when I've come close to using a really, I don't even know if you'd call it graphic, but much stronger sex scene is when it became part of the plot. In one, I think it was my first standalone called A Darker Place. This woman has to go undercover. She really doesn't want to do it anymore. And part of the way that she gets into character is that she sleeps with her FBI handler in a fairly strong way. I mean, I think that the words handcuffs and duct tape enter into it. But it's part of the plot because it's the only way that she can really become the person she needs to be to go undercover. And I found that an interesting experience to write because it is sex, but it is not just part of a relationship. It is part of this person's whole way of doing things in the book. But I think that for the most part, less is more. Now, this doesn't count, of course, if you're writing mainstream romance, because a lot of publishers, and especially if you're using a traditional publisher, a lot of publishers have very strict rules about how often, what kind, and where in the story.
Yeah.
Which is fine if you're the kind of writer who works well to an outline and you can fit your life in around those points. But if it's something that you are writing on your own from scratch, I think that you need to play with the ideas of how little and what kind you can get away with.
I like that as a sort of a starting point of starting with the less is more. And I think that you said a lot of stuff there that really goes with this theme that's popping out of letting our characters help us make these decisions. Thina, I know you've got a ton of stuff to say about this. I also know that Tammy does too. So if you will bear with me, I'm going to ask, I see Tammy's connection seems stable, so I'm going to throw to her first and then I'll bring it to you.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just saying, I get asked a lot like about sex scenes and about like writers are always scared to write them. And you mentioned that, Michelle. And one of the things I was going to say is what you can do is you can read a sex scene of something a little bit spicier than what you would write. So maybe you grab some erotica books and you read them. And then I suggest to writers that they kind of break them down. How did that erotica writer lay out that sex scene? And just kind of break it down mechanically, which might be a little awkward, but I think that will really help you get more comfortable with writing sex scenes because they're honestly not that much different than any other sex scenes, but there's so much taboo about them and stigma about them. I feel like people feel scared to approach them, but yeah, just like maybe take a few hours and break some sex scenes down and then see how your style of sex scene is going to be in your writing.
This
I really
reminds
love
me
that.
of the intimacy coaches that they're using now on movies and televisions.
Right?
So
Yeah.
you're sort of like
Yeah.
an intimacy writing coach.
Well, and
No.
you have to think about things like consent too. Like consent's really important, but maybe that's part of your mystery book is that there's a lack of consent and that becomes your mystery plot. But I think there's I think we need to get away from the old days of mystery writing when it was horrible, sexist, misogynist sex scenes that were in these, this male-dominated kind of writing style. And I think, yeah.
Totally agree. Thina.
Another thing I would beg of up and coming writers or any writer is also break out your anatomy book. You're not writing the Kama Sutra, and how many times does James Bond jump up after having been beaten senseless, broken a couple of ribs, and then he's off to bed with somebody? Oh no. You break a finger and you're just not going to be in a mood. So I don't write sex scenes because frankly, it's been a long time. But you also have to ask yourself in your market, who you're writing to. You're writing to yourself, but you're also writing to somebody. What is sexy? There's this hysterical comedian on. He's an older gentleman. He comes out and he says, I'm going back into the dating market. I don't know what I'm doing. What's sexy? I don't know what I'm doing. He said, I'm gonna, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna come over and say, hey, hi, can I unload your dishwasher for you? Hey, can I fold your laundry? I'll even press every other shirt. And he said, just like Eileen was doing there, he said, he's looking around the audience. He says, half the women in here are fanning themselves. He said, what is sexy?
And I think that brings up a really good point that, everybody has a different idea about what is sexy and what is not. And we can't figure that out. So I guess we just are doing the best that we can do, right? To try to appeal to what we think works for our story. And I saw both Peggy and Linda put their hands up. So I'm going to throw to Peggy and then to Linda.
Okay. One of the things with sex scenes for me, and I see a comment in the chat where somebody says it's not about sex, it's about bringing intimacy to the story. And it also goes back to what I was talking about earlier was the emotions. What makes a sex scene work for me as a writer, but also as a reader, is do the emotions that the characters are feeling at the moment feel right? And am I having an emotional experience as a result of this, which goes way beyond mechanics of sex and may not include the mechanics at all. If the feelings are correct and feel right for those characters in that moment. And for me, that's sort of the goal, is to try to create those those feelings. And yes, this is what these characters would be doing, and this is what how they would be reacting to what they are doing in this moment. And I think that's a
Absolutely.
big part of it for me, is that emotional aspect.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Linda. Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to add one thing that doesn't only relate to the topic of sex in writing a story, but it also relates to something that one of my favorite, best, most helpful coaches said to me about writing scenes that are either hot and not only sex, but suspense. You know, it's hot because there's so much happening and it's violent or whatever it is. And then a hot sex scene is to experiment with writing it cold versus hot. Do you know what I'm saying? Not mechanical, but just the way it would be observed.
I think, yeah, I think that's a good point. I think I understand what you mean, because when I was researching, as I've been trying to, get better at this, one of the pieces of advice that I thought was really interesting was one good way to balance the two genres is that, especially if you've got high octane or violence or bad things are happening, and then you need to have that place where the reader can take a breath, that a nice intimate interlude, whether that involves sex or not, can be a really good way to do that while still moving, your story forward. So I'm going to throw it to Eileen, because I feel like it's been a really long time since Eileen got to speak, and then we're going to wrap it up and go to questions. So Eileen, did you have something you wanted to say, or should I just send it to questions?
And one last thing to say about the sex scenes and sex in the books, although I do want to warn everybody, I was having technical difficulties earlier, so I'm on my phone and I'm getting low battery warnings. So if I suddenly disappear, it's not because I don't like you. Okay. So the sex has to mean something. It can't just be like there for the spice. So like if she has trust issues, and I mean, it requires a lot of trust to get naked with somebody, in my personal opinion. So it's like, it has to make sense like that. It has to make emotional sense. It has to make sense in the story. I've read a few books where they're like rushing to save the world, and then they just like, well, we'll just duck into this corner for a minute. It's like, no, so it has to make sense on an emotional level, on a story level, on a plot level. It just has to work that way. So it is a lot to balance there, but it is a really human thing, right? Most of us have that drive. So even though it can be really awkward to dig down into yourself and find out what that means to you, I think that's part of what makes it authentic on the page.
I love that. And yeah, and I want to say, as I am turning it over to the audience questions, that I want to just quickly thank you guys all for everything, because I don't know about the audience, but selfishly, I have gotten a ton of tips from, extremely practical, like breaking down the sex scenes, to Peggy's suggestion where next NaNoWriMo, I'm going to just use it to force myself to write some sex scenes, and to some of these more subtle issues about character and intimacy. This has been really helpful for me, and I hope it has been for other people too. So thank you. And with that, I am going to turn it over to audience questions, and maybe Laurie can help me wrangle some of those. Laurie, are you there? Hello.
I am here.
Yes.
So the questions are coming fast and furious, which, that's the tone of the panel, so that's okay. So let's see, I may miss them. I might just invite people on. We've had some good comments.
Let's open it up for discussion if you want.
Yeah, so
however you want to.
Lisa said, have they worked through the parts of the relationship and sharing, being there for each other, sex, comfort, safety, joy? So I think that goes back to maybe a discussion about bringing the reader to a point where intimacy is the next logical step. Right. So, and then it goes back to some of what you guys have said about what kind of a book is it? Who are these characters? Do they just clash and they meet and then they have some casual sex? They're not going to end up together. That's not a cozy.
Romance.
Yeah.
Maybe not even a romance. I don't know.
So what is, I've heard Janet Ivanovich's book called Cozies, right? But she definitely has a fair amount of random sex in there, right? With guys that she is and is not necessarily committed to. So where is that line? I don't know.
It depends.
You guys
Depends.
take these for discussion, and I'm going to ferret out some more questions for you.
Okay, sounds good.
Saren's popping in. She actually had a couple of good questions and comments. Saren, do you want to just unmute and ask those questions?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question so much, but I'm the past Golden State Romance Writers president, and I was talking to the current Golden State Romance Writers president, and we were both going like, why are they having such a problem with romance? I don't get it. And I think we're both here because we're wanting to learn the mystery elements of it. But for us, the character development is so tied into the romantic elements, not necessarily sex or anything, but the intimacy and the connection that gets to that HEA on the page. And I feel like it's just another really great tool for telling your story. And it's not an obstacle or anything. So that's, we were talking about how we need to do one of these where we can invite you guys all to come over and we can talk about romance with you.
Yes. That
Well,
would be
I'm
great.
glad that you're chiming in, because that's kind of what I'm hoping to get this fostering, right? Because I think mystery writer, speaking for myself, I don't know what I don't know about romance, right? And I suspect that there are romance writers who don't know what they don't know about mystery. But I'm seeing all kinds of hands goes up like Laurie. So Laurie, please.
I just wanted to point out that in whether it's a romance or whether it's mystery, a lot of the character development in both have to do with trust. And I think that to learn in the course of a mystery who you can trust, in the course of a relationship who you can trust, I think is a lot of where the overlap lies.
And that's a good point, because if there's a lot of suspicion and you're deliberately as an author trying to throw suspicion out there and trying to figure out who to trust, because the whole point of the story is that you can't trust anyone, or who can you trust, or someone's done something really bad, that does make creating that intimacy much harder.
It does. And I think we can go back to the moonlighting parable too, right? Where moonlighting was such a good show until they slept together, and then it was not good anymore. So, I mean, there's a time when you just don't do that. You jump the shark, don't jump the shark, right?
That's an interesting point, Laurie. I'm gonna, there's one thing I might know a little bit about with respect to romance and mystery, and that is how to keep something happening over a series. So my series is I'm about to start writing the 8th book. And my series started out with a woman who was emotionally stunted with respect to relationships, probably, and so she just had random sex pretty much. And then she found a guy. And now I've known sort of from the beginning what her wound was and used those obstacles along the way of the series. So I have helped her overcome her trust issues so she can have this relationship. And now we're about to see in my books where some of her partner's wounds are about to come out and now cause a new set. So for me, this issue of those psychological wounds fueling an overarching character thing in the series is really important. So I'm going to throw that out there and see what other people think about that.
Yes.
Linda, say more.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of brought that up earlier, that I think, it goes beyond romance and suspense. It goes to the protagonist, the main character. What happened to her or him? I just wrote, my last novel was a male protagonist for my first time, and it was so interesting to do that. But what happened to them as a child? What went wrong? What were the obstacles? Even if they had a normal childhood, something shaped their flaws. And what is that thing that shaped those flaws? And I think it's great to bring that out. It doesn't have to be the main part of the story, but we're all facing that, right, Michele? We're all facing that as we get older. And right now I'm writing my memoir, a collection of stories of growing up in the Bronx. And all this stuff, is coming out, but it's juicy stuff that could be implanted. And I have implanted some of that in my previous romantic suspense novels.
And I think
So-
it goes without saying that Laurie King has done, a great job of keeping this over a series. So I would love to hear any advice she has on that topic too.
I mean, it is one of those questions of when you have a series, especially if it's had the moonlighting situation, where you've had a long series of books where you have this unresolved sexual tension building and building and building, you got to do something. And some writers just keep it up. They just, as it were, they just manage to retain the distance and the energy between them as part of what the series is. But if you decide to follow the more expected track in terms of what actual people do and put them together, you then have to find some way of preserving that tension in some way. So that I found that in the Russell and Holmes books, for example, which is, I'm working on number 18 now, so it's been a while. There's still a lot of tension between them because they're different people and they have sources of disagreement and not entirely trust that goes on between them. That takes the place of the unresolved. That even though they are, they are married and that part of their relationship is settled. Nonetheless, there are these other things that are going on that are not settled and that are still leading to a certain amount of tension between them. And I think that's where you do have to have tension between two people, to have them just kind of settle in and say, oh, well, it's good to have all the questions out of the way now. It's just, why bother?
And I saw somebody in the comments, it might have been you, Saren, who talked about you saw romance as the obstacles that keep someone apart, right? I think that was you. Somebody said that in the chat. If it wasn't you, I apologize. I think that's a really interesting point, because that's a huge part of mystery, right? Is the obstacles that keep us from finding who the killer is or being able to catch the killer or whatever. So using that same approach to obstacles in a romance is interesting. But when you're talking about a long-term relationship, like, Mary Russell kind of situation, or like mine with my Joe Fournier, what do those obstacles look like, right? This whole, fighting over you didn't put your socks in the hamper is not sexy, right? We're not going to put that on the page. So what is it that allows us to be able to generate, interesting conflict in those kinds of situations? And I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on all of that. Yep, Peggy, please.
Well, one thought that I have, and I'm thinking back to the Deborah Crombie series again, is that relationships aren't static. I've been married quite a few years now, and the relationship that I have now with my husband is quite different than the relationship that we had back in year one. And so as you go through these different stages of the relationship, new obstacles, new problems, new things to resolve present themselves. Sometimes that requires a rebuilding of trust. Sometimes that requires working together to overcome whatever obstacle may be presented. So I think that there is, within a long-term relationship, and I haven't put any of this in a book yet, but I think there is a lot of ways you can play with things that happen between two people over the course of a developing relationship. Because if the relationship, romance says it builds to an HEA, the happily ever after, but ever after is a long time. And things change during the course of ever after. And so what situation are you dealing with now? What new crime and suspense thing is happening in your lives? If that's the direction you're taking it, if that's the kind of book you're writing.
So I guess I'm going to throw out
affect that HEA and maybe shift what the definition of HEA is for those people.
I'm going to throw out the term that I just learned, the HFN, right? So
Yes.
I think if we're doing series, we're ending each book with a happy for now.
Mhm.
And then, but I'm using that term not knowing what the implications are of it. So I hope I'm getting that right.
I'd like to
Yes,
jump
please.
in.
Oh, yeah, Beth, please, and then Tina.
I think I'm playing with the HFN, the Happily for Now, in my sci-fi mystery series because they have a long distance relationship. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong in a long distance relationship, including and also his job clashes a bit with her job. And I find that is a great source of tension. So I have that throwing in, and he's a spy and she's a detective, so he's got knowledge that he can't divulge, and that's been a constant source of trust issues. Actually, I love what you were saying, Laurie. The trust that she's had to fight, and I notice I'm constantly bumping up against new layers of trust. And then there's this other layer of found family that I'm playing with, and that, when you have two people coming together, they're creating a new family. Well, what does that mean, and what are people's family issues? And he's got a whole bag of issues that I haven't even really touched. So, I'm like, ooh, how am I going to sprinkle that in here in book 5? And then just like what promises people make to each other, and then circumstances happen, and then how does that impact the relationship? So that's a great source of tension as well. So I have my character at this very pivotal moment, like, what am I going to do next in my life? Well, what if her job takes her really, really far away, not just half a continent away, but, on a different space station, and, that kind of thing. So how does that affect the relationship? And then what are the two people going to do about that? Those are some of the things that I'm playing with currently. And so that's just some of the challenges about writing a long running series, is how do you continually find new ways to create these tensions that are very real.
Tina, you wanted to, and then we'll go back to Laurie for more questions.
Well, I always think in terms of what I call PONFAR, or the 7-year itch. And that is that, we have this cyclical nature, and I'm sure that our two educated psychologists, I'm not, I'm just crazy, but I'm sure our two psychologists can speak better to this, but we work sort of in a cyclical manner as people. And we have a kind of a point where we sort of look around and go, oh, well, what now? And it happens in relationships, and it's why we get midlife crises and things like that. And we don't get them at the same time as our partners. At best, if you wanted something that will stay with you and be like you for a certain amount of time, get a dog. They'll look like you after a couple of years, and the two of you could dress alike and you're fine. Unfortunately, the whole relationship will end anywhere between 11 and 17 years. But there is that mechanism, that there's a built-in conflict to the nature of the human being, and that is, we look around about every 7 years and go, what the heck? And if things are stagnant, then you have a problem, and there's your conflict. Or if expectations are completely different, if they're askew, you can have people come together, but that doesn't mean they're on the same page.
They're both dynamic organisms, which are then going to contribute to this dynamism between them.
Exactly. And they might have met in the same paragraph, to use the metaphor, but we're on the next paragraph, same page, but somebody's now halfway through their book. And I've lived that. And I think most of us in this call have lived that moment where they realize that they're suddenly either somewhere else in their life book or in another book altogether from the person that they're with. And either you have to get back together or something's up. How do you write that? And there's some tension. There's some very serious tension. So I think what goes wrong with Moonlighting or Northern Exposure is they get everybody together and boom, happily ever after.
Now what?
Now what? And they leave it at happily ever after, and that's boring.
Yeah, I
Happily
agree.
For now,
But not like Ozark.
Well, and Friends, I think of as a pretty good model of how they managed to play that out for years. It ended up being frustrating in its own way, right? This will they, won't they, will they, won't they? But at least they came up with some interesting ways to blow up that happily ever after, right? That at least I hadn't seen on TV before. So, but I'm going to send it back to Laurie and see if there are any other questions that we want to make sure that we're answering. And then we should probably pause and do the giveaway before too many people leave.
So that's where I was actually going to start, because we've lost a couple of people. So let me just see. Lindsay Hughes, are you, I believe you are still here. Can you unmute, turn on your camera and come forth if you would?
yay!
Yay! Our winner. Yay.
I can't believe it. Thank you guys. I never win anything. I really want to thank everyone for their insight and input. I have always dreamed of writing a cozy mystery, and I'm going to do it this year. And I actually subscribed to Beth's newsletter, which is how I found out about this, because I am in Texas.
Yay.
Are you a member of MWA or Sisters in Crime in your area? Or you could be a member of ours. We do so
No,
many things remotely
actually,
now.
while I was like, why, I should look and see if there is one. And I did Google it while I was still paying attention, but there is one for the Southeast. So I will sign up, and then I'll look into Sisters of Crime as well. Thank you.
Because I'll tell you,
there's definitely one for Sisters in Crime. I think it's in Houston.
That's perfect. That's where I am.
Okay, there's a Houston and then there's a Dallas Fort Worth. So I think there's both.
and Laurie was going to say something and I'm going to mute because of my phone.
Well, Lindsay, I will be the one who is mailing this. So if you would, rather than put your address here for everyone to enjoy, if you would send me an email, the best
Sure.
one to use is just info@laurierking.com. Make sure you put the R in there. So info@laurierking.com.
Okay, great.
And let me know where you are and when. So congratulations, and I hope you find it helpful. And for the rest of you who didn't win, I mean, it's out in paperback, and your library probably has one locally too. So
There's a lot of great advice in there. And I know that this is going to sound like a plug, like I'm trying to plug our organizations, but really my writing changed so much. It leveled me up so much when I joined MWA and when I joined Sisters in Crime. And to be frankly, when I started hanging out, what was then called Romance Writers of America too. The community and the resources that you're going to find there. If there's anybody here that is thinking about it, I would say really just check it out, because you're going to be amazed and you're going to wonder why you didn't join earlier. If you're actually, serious about getting something finished, it makes all the difference. I wish I had done it years earlier.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for that.
Thanks. So that was
Congratulations.
the first thing I was going to do. Second thing I was going to do is, I don't want to end the conversation, but I think I'm going to stop the recording. I think we've hit pretty much everything. And once I stop the recording, which I will do now,